In the shadow of the Bavarian Alps, where mist clings to ancient castles and legends whisper through pine forests, there lived a king whose story reads more like a dark fairy tale than historical fact. Ludwig II of Bavaria, known to history as the Mad King, ruled for 22 years in the 19th century. Yet his reign would end in mystery, madness, and a death so suspicious that even today, more than a century later, people still argue about what really happened on that fateful night in June 1886. But this isn't just another tale of royal excess or political intrigue. This is the story of a man who built impossible dreams in stone and mortar, who bankrupted a kingdom chasing fantasies, and who may have paid the ultimate price for refusing to live in the real world. Ludwig's castles still draw millions of visitors each year. His story inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle, and his mysterious death spawned conspiracy theories that persist to this day. What drove a king to madness? Was Ludwig truly insane, or was he the victim of a political conspiracy? And what really happened during those final, terrifying hours at Lake Starnberg? The answers lie buried beneath layers of Bavarian politics, family secrets, and the desperate actions of men who believed their king had lost his mind. To understand Ludwig's dark fate, we must first understand the man himself, and that story begins not with madness, but with a lonely child, thrust onto a throne he never wanted, in a world that was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. Ludwig was born in 1845 into the House of Wittelsbach, one of Europe's oldest royal dynasties. But this was not the Bavaria of medieval knights and fairy tales that would later consume Ludwig's imagination. This was the Bavaria of the mid-19th century, caught between the declining Austrian Empire and the rising power of Prussia, struggling to maintain its independence while the German states moved inexorably toward unification. From the very beginning, Ludwig was different. While other royal children played with toy soldiers and learned statecraft, Ludwig retreated into books, particularly the Romantic literature and Germanic mythology that would shape his entire worldview. He was fascinated by the operas of Richard Wagner, those epic tales of gods and heroes, of Siegfried and Parsifal, of kingdoms where honor mattered more than politics and beauty was worth any price. His father, King Maximilian II, was a practical ruler who understood the realities of 19th century politics. Bavaria needed allies, needed to modernize, needed to adapt to survive. But when Maximilian died suddenly in 1864, the crown passed to his 18-year-old son, and everything changed. Ludwig became king at one of the most turbulent times in German history. The old order was crumbling. Prussia, under the iron leadership of Otto von Bismarck, was systematically absorbing the smaller German states, creating a unified German empire under Prussian dominance. For Bavaria, the choice was stark: join willingly or be conquered. There was no middle ground, no romantic third option where Bavaria could remain the independent kingdom of Ludwig's dreams. But Ludwig seemed incapable of accepting this reality. Instead of focusing on the political crisis facing his kingdom, he threw himself into the world of art and architecture. He became the patron of Richard Wagner, funding the composer's increasingly expensive productions and building him a festival theater in Bayreuth. He spent hours listening to Wagner's operas, often requesting private performances in the middle of the night, losing himself in stories of mythical kingdoms and noble sacrifices. This obsession with Wagner revealed something crucial about Ludwig's character. He wasn't just a fan of the music. He was desperately trying to live inside the stories. Wagner's heroes were kings who ruled by divine right, who made decisions based on honor rather than expediency, who lived in a world where beauty and nobility mattered more than balance sheets and military treaties. For Ludwig, Wagner's operas weren't entertainment. They were an escape from the increasingly ugly realities of 19th century politics. But reality had a way of intruding. In 1866, Bavaria was forced to choose sides in the Austro-Prussian War. Ludwig, reluctantly following his minister's advice, allied with Austria against Prussia. It was a disaster. The Austrians were crushed in just 7 weeks. and Bavaria found itself at the mercy of the victorious Prussians. Only Bismarck's political cunning saved Bavaria from complete annexation. Instead, the kingdom was forced to sign a secret military alliance with Prussia, effectively ending its independence in all but name. For Ludwig, this defeat was more than a political setback. It was a personal catastrophe. The romantic kingdom he had inherited, the Bavaria of his imagination, was dying. In response, he did something that would define the rest of his reign and ultimately lead to his downfall. He began to build. Neuschwanstein Castle, Ludwig's most famous creation, was conceived in 1868 as more than just a royal residence. It was to be a shrine to the medieval past, a place where the old Germanic legends could live on in stone and mortar. Built on a rocky outcrop overlooking the village of Hohenschwangau, the castle was designed to look like something from a Wagner opera, complete with throne room decorated with scenes from Parsifal and an artificial grotto inspired by the Venusberg from Tannhäuser. But Neuschwanstein was just the beginning. Ludwig also built Linderhof Palace, a Rococo fantasy inspired by Versailles, complete with an artificial Venus grotto where he could recreate scenes from Wagner's operas. Then came Herrenchiemsee, an even more ambitious project. A complete replica of Versailles built on an island in Lake Chiemsee, intended as Ludwig's tribute to his hero, Louis XIV of France. These weren't just expensive hobbies. They were acts of defiance against the modern world. While Bismarck was building railroads and factories, while the new German Empire was becoming an industrial powerhouse, Ludwig was constructing monuments to a past that had never really existed outside of Romantic literature. He was trying to will his fairy tale kingdom into existence through sheer force of imagination and unlimited spending. The cost was staggering. Ludwig's building projects consumed not just his personal fortune, but began draining the Bavarian treasury. His ministers pleaded with him to moderate his spending, but Ludwig seemed incapable of restraint. He borrowed money from banks across Europe, mortgaged crown properties, and eventually began demanding loans from anyone who would listen. The king, who had inherited one of the most stable kingdoms in Germany, was systematically bankrupting it in pursuit of his impossible dreams. But the financial crisis was only part of the problem. Ludwig himself was changing, becoming increasingly isolated and erratic. He reversed his sleep schedule, conducting audiences in the middle of the night and sleeping through the day. He began avoiding public appearances, preferring to communicate with his ministers through written notes. When he did appear in public, courtiers noted his strange behavior. He would talk to himself, laugh at inappropriate moments, and seem to live in a world of his own creation. The stories of Ludwig's bizarre behavior became the stuff of legend. He allegedly held conversations with portraits of French kings, particularly Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He would order elaborate dinners for imaginary guests, complete with full table service and multiple courses, then eat alone while footmen served empty chairs. During sleigh rides through the Bavarian countryside, he would stop at peasant cottages and demand that the occupants pretend to be characters from his favorite operas. Perhaps most tellingly, Ludwig began to identify completely with the heroes of Wagner's stories. He saw himself as Parsifal, the pure knight seeking the Holy Grail, or as Ludwig II of France, the Sun King who ruled by divine right. Reality and fantasy became increasingly blurred in his mind. He wasn't just a king who enjoyed romantic literature. He was trying to live inside a romantic novel. His personal relationships suffered as well. Ludwig had always been something of a loner, but now he became almost completely isolated. His engagement to his cousin Sophie, sister of the famous Empress Elizabeth of Austria, was broken off under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors about his sexuality, whispers about inappropriate relationships with his male servants and courtiers. Whether these stories were true or simply malicious gossip spread by his political enemies, they added to the growing perception that something was seriously wrong with the king. Meanwhile, the political situation continued to deteriorate. In 1870, Bavaria was dragged into the Franco-Prussian War as Prussia's reluctant ally. Ludwig had no choice but to support the Prussian war effort, even though he privately sympathized with the French and despised everything Bismarck represented. When the war ended with Prussia's victory and the proclamation of the German Empire, Bavaria officially lost the last vestiges of its independence. Ludwig was still king, but only in name. Real power now rested with the German Kaiser in Berlin. For Ludwig, this final humiliation was unbearable. He had been forced to watch helplessly as his kingdom was absorbed into Bismarck's German Empire, as the old Bavaria of his dreams disappeared forever. His response was to withdraw even further from reality, spending vast sums on increasingly elaborate building projects while ignoring the growing crisis in his kingdom's finances. By the 1880s, Ludwig's behavior had become so erratic that even his most loyal supporters began to question his fitness to rule. He would disappear for weeks at a time, hiding in his various castles and refusing to see anyone. When he did emerge, he seemed to live in a completely different world, issuing bizarre orders and making decisions that made no sense to anyone around him. He allegedly planned to build a castle in the Himalayas, another in the Crimea, and even considered moving to a Greek island where he could live like a hermit. The breaking point came in 1885 when Ludwig's debts reached catastrophic levels. He owed millions of marks to creditors across Europe, and the Bavarian treasury could no longer cover his expenses. His ministers warned him that the kingdom faced bankruptcy, that they might have to sell the crown jewels and mortgage the royal palaces. Ludwig's response was to demand even more money for his building projects and to threaten to dismiss any minister who opposed him. It was then that a group of Bavarian politicians and courtiers began to discuss the unthinkable: removing Ludwig from the throne. Led by his uncle Prince Luitpold and supported by several prominent ministers, they began to explore the legal mechanisms for declaring a king unfit to rule. Under Bavarian law, a monarch could be removed if he was proven to be mentally incapable of governing. But such a drastic step had never been attempted before. The conspirators faced a major problem. They needed medical evidence of Ludwig's insanity, but the king refused to submit to any kind of psychiatric examination. Their solution was both clever and ethically questionable. They gathered testimony from servants, courtiers, and government officials about Ludwig's bizarre behavior, then presented this evidence to a panel of psychiatrists who would evaluate the king's mental state without ever actually examining him. The man chosen to lead this psychiatric evaluation was Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, one of Germany's most prominent alienists and the director of the Munich Psychiatric Hospital. Gudden was a respected scientist, but he was also a man of his time, someone who believed that mental illness could be diagnosed based on behavioral observations and family history. As political pressures mounted against Ludwig, his inner circle began to fracture. The king, who once commanded absolute loyalty, now found himself increasingly isolated, his trusted advisors either dismissed or gradually distancing themselves from what they perceived as his descent into madness. The Bavarian cabinet, led by Prince Regent Luitpold, watched with growing alarm as Ludwig's behavior became more erratic and his spending more reckless. By 1885, the situation had reached a breaking point. Bavaria's debt had swollen to catastrophic proportions, largely due to Ludwig's relentless castle construction projects. Neuschwanstein alone had consumed millions of marks, while Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee continued to drain the royal coffers. The king's requests for loans from foreign banks had been repeatedly denied, and his attempts to secure funding through increasingly desperate measures only served to further alienate potential allies. The final straw came when Ludwig began making wild threats. In moments of desperation, he reportedly spoke of selling his castles to foreign buyers, or even of abdicating and fleeing Bavaria altogether. These statements, whether genuine or merely the ravings of a man under extreme pressure, were taken seriously by the Bavarian government. The prospect of their king abandoning his duties or, worse, potentially selling state assets to foreign powers, galvanized his opponents into action. The conspiracy against Ludwig was methodical and merciless. Led by his own uncle, Prince Luitpold, and supported by key government ministers, A plan was hatched to have the king declared mentally incompetent. This would allow them to establish a regency and effectively remove Ludwig from power while maintaining the facade of monarchical continuity. The legal justification would come from medical testimony declaring the king unfit to rule. Here's where the story takes its most sinister turn. The government commissioned a psychiatric evaluation of Ludwig, but with a crucial and damning detail. The evaluation was conducted entirely without the king's knowledge or consent. Dr. Bernhard von Guden, Bavaria's most prominent psychiatrist, was tasked with preparing a report on Ludwig's mental state. Remarkably, Guden never personally examined the king. Instead, he relied entirely on second-hand accounts, rumors, and testimonies from servants and former courtiers, many of whom had their own grievances against their former employer. The process was a mockery of medical ethics and legal procedure. Guden interviewed dismissed servants who spoke of the king's nocturnal wanderings, his elaborate theatrical performances for an audience of one, and his conversations with portraits. Former valets described finding Ludwig in his gardens at dawn, dressed in historical costumes, lost in elaborate fantasies. Kitchen staff reported bizarre dining arrangements where the king would set places for long-dead historical figures and conduct animated conversations with empty chairs. While these behaviors were certainly eccentric, they hardly constituted clinical insanity by any reasonable medical standard. Ludwig was functional in many respects, still capable of conducting state business when necessary, and showed no signs of the violent or self-destructive tendencies typically associated with severe mental illness. His eccentricities were more akin to those of an artistic temperament pushed to extremes by isolation and pressure than the ravings of a madman. Nevertheless, Guden's report painted a picture of a monarch completely divorced from reality, a danger to himself and his kingdom. The document described Ludwig as suffering from paranoid delusions, grandiose fantasies, and an inability to distinguish between reality and his elaborate dream world. The report was signed by 3 other prominent physicians, none of whom had examined the king either. They simply endorsed Guden's conclusions based on his second-hand research. Armed with this dubious medical testimony, the conspirators moved swiftly. On June 10, 1886, a government commission arrived at Neuschwanstein Castle with the devastating news. King Ludwig II had been declared mentally incompetent and was immediately deposed. Prince Luitpold would serve as regent, and Ludwig was to be taken into protective custody for his own safety and medical treatment. The scene at Neuschwanstein that day was both tragic and surreal. Ludwig, who had retreated to his fairy tale castle as his final refuge, found himself trapped within its walls. The very building that represented his greatest artistic achievement had become his prison. Reports described the king as initially defiant, refusing to believe the pronouncement and demanding to see the medical evidence against him. When informed that he had been examined and found wanting without his knowledge, Ludwig reportedly flew into a rage, declaring the entire proceeding a treasonous farce. The deposed king's final hours of freedom were spent in the castle he loved most. He wandered the halls he had designed, past the elaborate murals depicting Wagner's operas, through rooms that had been crafted to bring his romantic visions to life. The irony was cruel. The man who had spent his reign trying to escape reality was now being forcibly returned to it in the most brutal way possible. As night fell on June 10th, Ludwig was informed that he would be transferred the following day to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg, where he would be kept under medical supervision. The choice of location was significant. Berg was a relatively modest royal residence, a stark contrast to the elaborate fantasy palaces Ludwig had created. It would serve as both prison and symbol of his fall from grace. The journey from Neuschwanstein to Berg was Ludwig's last as a free man, though freedom is perhaps too generous a term. He was accompanied by Dr. Guden and a small entourage of guards and officials. Traveling through the Bavarian countryside, he had once ruled absolutely. Contemporary accounts suggest Ludwig was sullen and withdrawn during this journey, perhaps finally grasping the full magnitude of his situation. Upon arrival at Berg Castle, Ludwig was placed under constant supervision. His every movement was monitored, his correspondence restricted, and his contact with the outside world severely limited. The man who had once commanded armies and directed the construction of architectural marvels was now reduced to the status of a patient, his daily routine dictated by medical staff and government overseers. Dr. Gooden, despite having never properly examined Ludwig before orchestrating his downfall, now found himself in the peculiar position of being the deposed king's primary physician. The two men, so different in temperament and worldview, were now bound together in this strange, final chapter. Gooden, a man of science and rationality, found himself face to face with the eccentric monarch whose mental state he had so confidently diagnosed from afar. The atmosphere at Berg Castle during those final days was heavy with tension and foreboding. Ludwig, stripped of his royal prerogatives and facing an uncertain future, oscillated between periods of resigned melancholy and flashes of his old imperious nature. Staff reported hearing him pacing his rooms at night, muttering about betrayal and justice. During the day, he would often stand at the windows overlooking Lake Starnberg, staring out at the water with an expression that observers found deeply unsettling. The lake itself seemed to call to Ludwig during these final hours. Lake Starnberg, with its dark waters and mist-shrouded shores, had always held a romantic appeal for the deposed king. In happier times, he had enjoyed boating on its surface and walking along its banks. Now, confined and under constant watch, the lake represented something else entirely. Perhaps an escape, perhaps an ending, perhaps both. The events of June 13, 1886, would transform Ludwig from a deposed monarch into one of history's most enduring mysteries. What happened on that fateful evening by the shores of Lake Starnberg would spawn countless theories, investigations, and debates that continue to this day. On the morning of June 13, 1886, the world lost one of its most enigmatic rulers under circumstances that continue to baffle historians and conspiracy theorists alike. The official account states that Ludwig II, now deposed and confined to Berg Castle, took his final walk with Dr. Gooden along the shores of Lake Starnberg. What happened during those twilight hours remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. According to the sanitized version presented to the public, the king and his physician went for an evening stroll around 8 o'clock. When they failed to return by 10, search parties were organized. Both bodies were discovered in the shallow waters of the lake just after midnight. Dr. Gooden showed clear signs of a violent struggle, with facial injuries and torn clothing suggesting he had fought desperately against his attacker. Ludwig, however, appeared almost serene, floating face down in water barely 4 feet deep, a man who had never learned to swim found in conditions that should not have been fatal. The inconsistencies in the official narrative are staggering. How does a non-swimmer end up in water deep enough to drown while his physician, presumably trying to save him, bears the marks of a fierce battle? Why were there no witnesses to this alleged suicide attempt? Most damning of all, why was the autopsy performed so hastily, and why were its findings kept secret for decades? The truth, as it often does, reveals itself in the details that authorities hoped would remain buried. Independent investigations later revealed that Ludwig's lungs contained no water, indicating he had not drowned. There were mysterious wounds on his body that suggested violence, and witnesses reported hearing gunshots from the direction of the lake that evening. The coachman who drove Ludwig and Dr. Gooden to their fateful walk later claimed he was ordered to leave immediately and was specifically instructed not to wait for their return, a highly unusual departure from royal protocol. Perhaps most tellingly, the political implications of Ludwig's death were immediately apparent. Within hours of the discovery of his body, his uncle Luitpold assumed the regency, and the troublesome matter of Bavaria's independence was quietly shelved. The massive debts incurred by Ludwig's castle projects suddenly became manageable through mysterious infusions of cash, and the political conspirators who had orchestrated his downfall found themselves in positions of unprecedented power. The psychiatric evaluation that had declared Ludwig insane was revealed to be even more fraudulent than initially suspected. Dr. Gooden had never actually examined the king, basing his diagnosis entirely on second-hand accounts provided by Ludwig's political enemies. The 4 psychiatrists who signed the document condemning Ludwig as mentally unfit had never met him, never observed his behavior, and never conducted any form of clinical assessment. It was a medical opinion purchased and paid for by men who needed Ludwig removed from power. Modern forensic analysis suggests that Ludwig II was almost certainly murdered, likely shot while attempting to escape across the lake. The presence of a small boat, later found hidden in nearby reeds, supports the theory that the king was attempting to flee to Austria, where his cousin, Empress Elizabeth, had promised him sanctuary. Dr. Gooden, despite his role in the conspiracy, may have genuinely tried to prevent the assassination, explaining his injuries and the evidence of struggle. The Mad King Ludwig II was neither mad nor a failure. He was a dreamer crushed by the brutal machinery of 19th-century realpolitik, a romantic who refused to accept the death of beauty in an increasingly industrial world. His castles, dismissed as follies during his lifetime, now generate more revenue for Bavaria than any other tourist attraction. His patronage of Wagner created some of the greatest operatic works in history. His vision of a fairy tale kingdom, ridiculed by his contemporaries, has inspired countless artists, writers, and filmmakers. The dark fate of Ludwig II serves as a chilling reminder of how power operates when threatened by those who dare to dream differently. He was destroyed not by madness, but by men who could not tolerate his refusal to conform to their vision of a pragmatic, militaristic future. In the end, the Mad King's greatest tragedy was not his death, but that he was born into a world too small and too cruel for the grandeur of his imagination.